Welcome everyone, very excited to be here. We've got a full house, which I think just represents the interest in this topic that we're going to be talking about today, boys to men, remodelling masculinity. So for those of you who don't know, my name's Emma Fulu and I'm the founder and CEO of the Equality Institute. And before we get started, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on tonight, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I think, given the conversation we're about to have tonight, it's also really important to acknowledge that our First Nations people experience disproportionate rates of gendered violence because of the ongoing impacts of colonisation and discrimination and structural racism. But at the same time, they're the ones that are often at the forefront leading this change that we need to see. So I've been conducting research for about 20 years on masculinities, why some men use violence and what we can do to prevent it. So I'm just thrilled to be able to have this conversation with you all tonight. It seems that this is a more important conversation than ever at this time with, we've got rising popularity of people like Andrew Tate, lists ranking teenage girls on their appearance in schools. But I think on the flip side, we're also seeing, greater expression of multiple forms of gender identity, diverse ideas of what it can mean to be a man. And we know that the good news is masculinity, it's not static. There is no one model of masculinity. And I think probably we're all here because we're interested in creating positive change. So this is a conversation tonight about that, about positive change. And we're not here to critique any single person or any group of people. We're really here to have a positive conversation. So I know we're really curious about who's actually in the room. Can I just ask if you might raise your hand if you're a teacher? Great, cool. Can you raise your hand if you're a parent? Excellent. Can you raise your hand if you thought this was about the 90s group Boys to Men and you're very confused? Okay, good. No. So I am thrilled to be joined on stage by two incredible people to share their wisdom on this complex topic. And honestly, we've been sort of going back and forth on email thinking we could talk about this for days. We're going to try and cover as much as we can in an hour. They don't need much introduction, but in case you have been living under a rock and don't know who they are, let me start by introducing Tarang Chawla, who is an advocate, writer, speaker, educator, commissioner at the Victorian Multicultural Commission, and also the co-founder of Not One More Niki, a grassroots non-profit working to end men's violence against women, which was named in memory of his younger sister, Nikita, who was murdered by her partner in 2015. And then Jane Gilmore is an author, ex-journalist from Melbourne. Her book, Fixed It, Violence and the Representation of Women in the Media, was published in 2019. And her latest book, love the title, Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children, published in 2023, and I know you're selling that book at the end of the night and signing copies, so please stick around for that. So let's give them a round of applause. A little bit of quick housekeeping. We will have a Q&A session at the end. We should have about 10-15 minutes, hopefully, so get your tough questions ready. But for the safety of the participants and everyone here tonight, we ask that you do not share survivor stories tonight. And we recognise that some of the conversations we may have can be emotionally challenging. If you need to step out at any time, there's a room at the back and the ushers can help you with that. And please remember to call 1-800-RESPECTS if you need any support or anyone you know needs support. So with that out of the way, shall we dive in?
Let's go.
I wanted to start with you, Jane.
Yep.
So everyone's talking about this rise of misogyny, the manfluencer culture, the manosphere, which I didn't even know was a thing until recently. But it's not necessarily a new phenomenon. So Do you think it's actually increasing, or is it just that we're hearing more about it? Is it just that social media is amplifying it? How do you see it? What's playing out?
Look, it's absolutely not new. You can trace it back to the beginning of the women's rights. Ernest Bax, I think in 1890-something, wrote about the legal subjugation of men because of all the poor men who, like some 11-year-old girl, could come along and say that he'd sexually assaulted her and sexually abused her, and people might believe her and he would have consequences, and that was so grossly unfair that he had to write an essay about it. So he was one of the first ones, but it matches almost exactly along the lines of the rise of women's rights. And ever since then, you can draw a straight line from him through to Andrew Tate. So Tate's not new, he's not original, he's not doing anything special, he gets a lot of attention, but he's the spiritual great-grandson of P.T. Barnum, who was a ringmaster and politician, the one who was supposedly coined the phrase, "there's a sucker born every day." That's Andrew Tate. Tate is manufacturing shame in young men and boys and then profiting from it. That's his whole shtick, that's what he does, and he does it by deliberately creating shame about their masculinity. And I spent a couple of weeks a while back watching his videos. It was not a good time for me, and it's taken months to clean up my algorithm since then. But his whole thing is that to be a man, you have to be hard, you have to be powerful, you have to be muscled, you have to be in control, you have to be aggressive, you have to look like me, you have to have money, you have to not have any interest or care or respect for women, because that just makes you weak. And if you're weak, you're a bad person, you're not worth anything. If you want a cure for that, put in your credit card details here and I'll help you. Buy my special stake oil and you too will be a good, strong, powerful man. The thing that's, I think, possibly different about him, so there was Milo Yiannopoulos before him, you know, there's that very long line. Where Tate's getting more notice is the amplification by social media. One of my wonderful colleagues, who I'm hoping is here tonight, sent me a piece of research yesterday that was done by, it was Dublin City University. It's very, very hard to track what the algorithms are doing because, of course, they don't release the algorithms. But they set up a number of accounts that were labelled as 16-year-old boys and 18-year-old boys. Some of them were deliberately searching for manosphere content. Others were searching for typical teenage boy stuff like sport and how to meet girls. And it took a minimum of 2 minutes and a maximum of 23 minutes before they were served Andrew Tate-style content. If, even out of just curiosity, they clicked on it, within a couple of days, it was 75% of their content, of the suggested content. So this is happening to boys whether they want to see it or not, whether they're looking for it or not. If they're just looking to what's happening with my football team and how do I shave and what should I do with my hair and what do you say to girls, they will get Andrew Tate. The effect of this in classrooms is actually devastating, and it matches fairly closely with things like the National Community Attitude Survey, the NCAS, which says somewhere between 20 and 30% of young boys and men have, let's call them problematic attitudes towards women. In a classroom, I go into classrooms quite regularly, in a classroom of, say, 26 to 28 kids, 13 boys, what that means is 3 or 4 boys in every classroom have those attitudes. And when you sit and watch what is happening with that, it's horrifying, because part of it is performative. So when they're doing it, they're not looking, it's worse if they've got a young female teacher. That's always much, much worse, and they're doing it for each other. So you can see them glancing sideways. Are you seeing me do this? Are you seeing me denigrate her and sneer at her and put her down? Are you approving of me? Yeah. Are you laughing along? And then they'll look at the other boys. What are you doing? How are you reacting? Can we shame you for not participating? The bystander effect is what happens to the girls. Then what happens to the teacher as this is going on, particularly the younger teachers, where it's worse, they'll go to school leadership, which are often men, often the few men in primary schools, and say, this is happening in my classroom and I need a response. And the response that they'll get is, well, it's your job to manage a classroom. If you can't manage the classroom, maybe you need to think about a different profession. So all the kids in the class, there's only 3 or 4 boys doing it. all those kids are watching this happen, and they're watching the teachers being helpless and the school leadership refusing to intervene, and they all learn a lesson from that. And the boys who have really good, solid values about women, about themselves, about the way they relate to other people, go silent, because they know the punishment for standing up for themselves and for other people is shame and sometimes even violence. They are horrified by it often, but they won't say so, because they will be punished, which then reinforces to the boys who are doing it that this is the right thing to do. So this is all going on. Used to be more concentrated in high schools. We're now seeing it commonly in grade 5. So I remember talking to a kid once. He was 11, I think, and he was talking to me about gold diggers. And I'm like, dude, you're 11. You've never, what, are you worried about a bunch of 10-year-old girls roaming the playground coming to scam you out of your pocket money? Come on, what's going on here? And so I started digging into it, and I asked him about his mum, because he'd already told me about his family. He'd told me his parents were married. I said, is that why your mum married your dad? And he was outraged. Don't you talk about my mum like that. My mum's a nurse. She's got all the money she needs. And I'm like, oh, little dude, wow. But this is because to him, this idea of women, the gold diggers who will make up false rape allegations, which are the two things that they're most worried about, that's the enemy. That's this amorphous idea of women who will do him harm, who are a threat to him. But it's not real. It's not his mum who he adores and he's lovely to. It's not his sisters who annoy him, but they're real people. So when he goes home and he's interacting with his parents, the lovely nurse and her husband who's like Bluey's dad, in that wonderful family, that's not happening. So in that process, what I'm then supposed to do is talk to the teacher and say, look, that little kid over there, problematic attitudes, we need to do something about that. She does the right thing and goes to his parents. And the parents are like, what are you talking about? He is so lovely at home because he doesn't have his mates there that he's got to perform in front of. He's got his mum who he adores, and he is that lovely, sweet kid that I saw. He was a really sweet kid, apart from this manufactured stuff. The problem from there, though, is that if that communication isn't managed well, which it often isn't because nobody really knows what they're talking about, the parents stop trusting the teacher because why is she telling lies about my son? The teacher stops trusting the parents because I'm trying to help your kid here, he's in trouble, and you're not listening to me. So they stop talking.
So we're getting a breakdown of
We get a breakdown. And from there, that kid's
cycle
continuing to
continues.
get that content. He's continuing to watch it. That sweet little 11, 12-year-old boy that I saw, if he's still going with that by the time he's 18 and nobody's interrupted it, he's now a frightened, angry man who thinks that the only way that he can deal with women because they are a threat is to be in control, to be powerful, to be the one that is in charge, and don't trust them because they're dangerous. That is every single thing that you need to create a violent, abusive man. And the thing that just does my head in about this screaming into a pillow kind of stuff is that all the way through that, he's been doing consent and respectful relationships education. But because of that first interaction, he's going into every one of them suspicious and defensive, going, you're here to tell me I'm bad, my mum said so, or my family said so. So then people say, well, he's done 6 years of consent education, it doesn't work. And it did work. It did exactly what it was supposed to do when he was 11, which was identify kids with problematic attitudes, children who are being subjected to harm and need help. It identified them and it clarified what was going on for the rest of the kids who are sitting there helpless in that classroom watching what's going on and not understanding it. Where it all fell apart was the structural barriers that stopped us taking it a step further. And I'm sure we'll get into that.
We're going to absolutely get into that and some of the solutions, and definitely a lot of focus on the structural. And I think that leads nicely before we get there, because we were talking a lot about these individuals and these groups, a small, in a sense, a handful of people, but are performing this hypermasculinity, and then they're watching a lack of action from society, and then that's being reinforced by their peers and that lack of trust that you're talking about. But we know that it's these systems that we're talking about. That's not just about individual boys. So Tarang, I want to bring you in, and what are you seeing in terms of what's actually driving this misogyny? If we take the 11-year-old boy out of it for a minute, what is the sort of some of the harmful attitudes and structures that are really driving this from the root cause?
It's a really great question. I think, Jane, I mean, you could give a masterclass on all of this, but when you spoke about all the way back from the 1890s through to today, I think we have to take Andrew Tate or any particular figure like him, anyone who is using social media to propagate harmful ideas about what it means to be a man and what it means to behave towards women and other groups. We have to take that in context. And the context there is particularly post-second wave feminism, where we are seeing, thankfully, increasing levels of women's independence, increasing levels of women's ability to leave abusive or violent or even unhappy relationships. We are seeing an underbelly of men who exercise power and control over those women in the context of, say, domestic partner and intimate partner homicide. But in terms of younger groups, we're seeing how a lot of the avenues that men were boys were socialised into becoming men, as problematic as some of them were and still are. A lot of those have been removed from boys and men, or have, with the progress of time and technology, failed to exist. And so Andrew Tate is one person who has capitalised on that. And the irony, I think, is that he speaks to this idea of what it means to be a quote-unquote real man and to be strong and dominant and secure, and yet he manufactures that notion, he creates that notion through tapping into insecurity, or, as Jane rightfully pointed out, creating shame where shame necessarily wasn't there. And so I think, there's no one particular individual root cause, because we have to look at it in terms of the trajectory and the timeline. He just happens to be the person at this point in time who has found a way to connect with vulnerable, young, impressionable boys and men, and created for them a sense of community. And he's done it in such a way where he has, not everything that Andrew Tate says, like anyone, is bad. No one is fundamentally good or bad. This is not about a question of morality. It is about how he uses certain things to get boys interested. If when I work with young boys and men and seek to understand what's driving their particular individual interest in a figure like Tate, they'll often talk about, I want to get fast cars, I want to impress my friends, I want to work hard, I want to be successful. Right? And if I take those last two about working hard and being successful, we can critique, success in terms of a neoliberal capitalist system, right? But that's not the conversation we're having with them. We're trying to understand, hey, you want to be successful, what does that look like? And why do you want to be successful? And they start, he uses terms like, hustling and working hard. And those principles of working hard, I'm from a South Asian migrant background. My parents told me to work hard regardless of the outcome. It was drilled into me from a very young age. And so there's certain ideologies that he uses to his advantage while simultaneously creating shame and insecurity, right? Yeah. And then ultimately getting people's money. Right? And so he is, one of the things that frustrates me most about him is that he's a grifter, right? And that is just the lowest form of person to be. He doesn't actually care about the well-being of boys and men at all. And so his ideas are harmful, as well as, all of the crimes which he's alleged to have committed around rape and human trafficking, etc., are just deplorable, right? So from someone who's deeply concerned about the role that he has in society, I'm kind of hoping that the court process actually runs its course and has a favourable outcome in the sense that he's found to have committed the acts that he's alleged to have done, because then at least those of us who oppose him can say, well, look at what horrible things he did. What kind of horrible person and role model is that? And we can use things that everybody will abhor, because at the moment he finds a strong sense of connection with a lot of impressionable young boys.
Yeah. I mean, it's a symptom of a system that the patriarchy, interestingly, creates this model of, the dominant model of masculinity, which is virtually unattainable, that no one actually can attain that version of success, whether it's the physical strength or the wealth, which then plays into this and builds this shame around it, and it creates, it's directly intended to do that. It's working, and he's a symptom of that, I think. But it makes me, a lot of what you're talking about is globally we're seeing this, we've seen progress. We've seen some massive progress around women's rights. At the same time, we're seeing a huge backlash. And that, I do a lot of work internationally, is incredibly well-funded and coordinated. I mean, as part of a group I'm with, I was reporting around the level of funding for some of this anti-gender rights movements and where it's coming from. It is scary, in the multi-billions of dollars. So it has a huge amount of funding. It's systematic, it's coordinated. You've got social media companies profiting off promoting harmful content. So in some ways, individual teenage boys, they're up against massive structural, powerful, well-funded institutions. What hope do they have? But there's hope, I'm sure. But Jane, can you talk a bit more, we've touched on it for sure, but about how this is structural and therefore requires, as you were saying, structural solutions?
It absolutely is structural, and it's back to screaming in my pillow when I hear people talking about boys that have done terrible things and saying, well, where did the parents go wrong? And I'm like, the parents had no choice. We are up against such strong structural forces. TikTok made $16 billion last year. $16 billion last year. And a lot of that comes from serving content like Andrew Tate's. Now, while I agree with Tarang that hopefully he will be gone soon, I am also completely confident that the next Andrew Tate is waiting in the wings.
Absolutely.
And he will have to be that bit more shocking and that bit more extreme to get that attention. So, that's going to be horrible. But it will absolutely happen. And while TikTok's making $16 billion out of serving that content, while Andrew Tate is certainly not making anywhere close to that, he's making in the millions. While that's still an option, there will absolutely still be people there to do it. That is a structural problem that parents can't fight against. When we're talking, Julie Inman-Grant, the eSafety Commissioner, was on Radio National a few days ago talking about the Nudify apps, which is where you can take any image at all, put it into an app and generate any image from porn that you like. So I could pull out my phone right now, take a photo of you, and within minutes, I can have a photo of you that looks like you are participating in really vile, degrading sexual acts. And then I can use that to threaten, intimidate, blackmail, or just humiliate you. Now, if I did that, I'm not going to do that, by the way, just to be clear. If I did do that, you should report me to the police. They might even take you seriously, who knows? But the fact that that app is available, the fact that that's what it is designed to do, and it is not a crime to make that app or sell that app or make money out of that app, that is specifically designed to give men tools and boys tools to harass and humiliate women. This is a structural problem that parents cannot individually fight against. The other structural issues too are, if we go back to that 11-year-old boy, what were the structural issues that stopped everybody doing what they needed to do when he was 11? It was partly, I think, knowledge. So the most powerful, motivated, engaged prevention workforce in the country are parents and teachers, the people in our villages raising our children. But like any workforce, they need skills. They need training, they need knowledge, they need resources, and they need somebody to go to when they hit a problem they can't manage. And at the moment, that doesn't exist. It is so hard to do, to get that. I work in an organisation, I think there's a bit less than 20 people there. To stay on top of the technology, just that is a full-time job. To stay on top of the research and go, well, what works and what doesn't, and what's been tried and what was the effects? Okay, well, we need to adapt this. And if that works in a very expensive private school for boys, what happens if we take the same approach in a school that's got a lot of First Nations kids? And what happens when there's a lot of neurodiverse kids in the room? And what happens when we've got queer kids? Are they being excluded? Are they being included? How do we manage all of this and deal with the tater-tots in the room and deal with the girls who are being silenced and frightened, and you can see their body language going like this as they hunch down? How do we deal with all of that? Requires a level of expertise that is expensive. On the other hand, and I regularly do this, where I'm in a room and people will say, well, what's the cost of running that program? And I'm like, you're asking the wrong question. Because the cost of men's violence against women. The last one I saw was KPMG, and they said it was something like $22 billion in 2015. If we took half that amount in today's terms and invested it in upskilling the most motivated prevention workforce in the country, which, as I said, is parents, and gave them the training and the ability to look after their kids so that when that conversation happens, they understand the context, they understand what they need to do, they know how to get help, they know how to have those conversations, they know how to talk to this boy who is being harmed. He is not a bad kid, he's not a perpetrator, he's a child who is being harmed by somebody who is intentionally harming him for profit. So giving his parents and his teachers all the skills they need and the support they need to prevent that harm happening, which is what they want. But then when you start looking at other structural barriers, so this is, you know, a nurse and Bluey's dad. Like, it's so wholesome that golden retriever puppies are spontaneously bursting into being in the backyard. What happens when that's not the case? If that family is living in poverty, if all they can do is struggle to find food and keep a roof over their head, and I have been there and it is all-consuming. There is no room for anything else. If that family is not Bluey's dad and the lovely nurse, but dad's actually really violent and abusive, and mum knows that if her son goes to any of those classes or has any of that work done, that she will be punished for it, and so will he. So she protects him by keeping him away from those classes or by denigrating them. If there's they don't speak very good English, there's yet another massive structural barrier. If it's a First Nations family and they want to go and seek help and they know the response is going to be, oh, are you not looking after your children properly? We better take them off you. That is an insurmountable structural barrier that we cannot then say, well, it's your fault, you didn't do anything. So again, like, my screaming pillow is disintegrating because these things are not the fault of individuals, and to put it back on parents and say, well, we're not going to give you what you need to address this problem, and teachers, you are not going to get the training, you are not going to get the support, you're not going to get the resources. Teach it properly, do it yourself, do it without any expert help, and then it's your fault if that doesn't work. I mean, these are what we're talking about, structural barriers. These are massive structural barriers, and they are everywhere.
And we are going to promise we are going to get to structural solutions. We will not let you leave feeling depressed and helpless.
Tarang, we were having sort of a side conversation about, we're talking a lot about masculinity, we're talking a lot about boys, and how do we sort of keep in focus women and girls and what we might call a pro-feminist approach when we are thinking about solutions, and what does that actually look like in practice? I mean, I don't know if everyone will align with the term necessarily, and that doesn't matter as much. The term isn't as important as what does it look like in practice.
Yeah, I think firstly, just everything that Jane said around that idea of this illusion of choice, or this fallacy that it is a choice for parents when there are such broad structural and systemic barriers that take away any real sense of being able to choose in terms of how they raise their children, particularly when there's access to, artificial intelligence, algorithm apps that can create child pornography. I think in terms of the question you've just asked, Emma, for me, it's like born out of, and I've been in spaces where, particularly advocating following the murder of my sister, I've been in spaces where I'll be one of the few, if only, male voices in a room, right? And I think that the idea of how we engage boys and men in conversations around the prevention of gender-based violence, whether that's in intimate partner settings or sexual and street harassment, or any forms of the spectrum of broad continuum of harmful behaviours that men enact primarily upon women, there's been a real scarcity of male figures, right? And that's not unique to Australia. That's sort of happened, almost globally, right? That's not to say that there aren't many, many men in communities doing really important work. I see, some familiar faces of men in the room here. But what I've observed, and I know we've had conversations about this, Emma, around how some of the current framework around engaging boys and men has gone into what for lack of a better term, what I'd call mollycoddling boys and men, which I find a very strange way of approaching men and masculinities generally. Because if we're to assume that dominant, hegemonic, stereotypical ideas of masculinity are strong, are secure, are quite stoic, then why would we have to default to, oh, poor men, oh, it must be so hard to be a man, oh, look at how much men are struggling, in order to get them to care about the experiences and feelings and harms that men as a collective are enacting upon either themselves or others. And so I think one of the challenges now is around how we frame conversations that seek to engage boys and men. And I think that one of the ways that's sort of come to the fore in more recent times has been around mental health, right? Or framing this as an issue around public health. And feminist researchers, feminist activists and advocates have been calling violence committed against women as a public health issue for the longest time.
Yeah.
That report that Jane refers to, the figure was 22.3 billion in 2015 by KPMG Australia. The one prior to that was a PwC one, and that was something like 17.4 billion, and that was in 2011. So we don't have one for 9 years on since. And we know that, for example, during the COVID pandemic years where we were at home, that there was an increase in certain types of intimate partner violence. We also saw that, for example, the Australian Institute of Criminology showed that there was a 28% increase year on year from 2021 to 2022 in terms of intimate partner homicides. So that's what's happening on the ground, right? And if we've got a movement that's seeking to engage boys and men that's saying, oh, look, you know, we have to care about men's and boys' mental health, or we have to be really conscious about how we raise boys because of their mental health, I think what we are doing in the process, worst case wittingly, but best case unwittingly, is removing the object of harm that is the product of these harmful attitudes, right? And I think that's why these attitudes actually matter, because far be it for me to sit on a stage somewhere or to blare into someone's headphones saying what you think could be harmful, right? We're all entitled to have independent thoughts. If I'm in a room and someone has certain views around gender roles and ideologies, so what? But the harms that some of these things can cause in the real world are what we're actually concerned about. And that's where we can't ignore the realities of how much men are perpetrating these acts of violence or harm or degradation on not just women, but on girls. Boys, you know, boys ranking the appearance of girls and then circulating Excel or Google spreadsheets among their peers at the age of 13, 14. That's so humiliating for the girls involved, and such a violation, right? They're there to learn, they're there to be educated, and yet they are having their human rights taken from them in that situation. And so I think what we have to do in terms of being pro-feminist with these boys is we actually have to understand that despite all the shame, despite everything, the boys are actually a lot tougher, right, than we perhaps give them credit for. That we can have some difficult conversations with them while treating them as the young adults that they are, right? And it's all about being age appropriate. I think that we can't continue down this line of letting issues of men's mental ill health masquerade either as excuses or justifications for men's actions. But we also can't use that as the only entry point into the conversations. We have to really reckon with the structural and systemic barriers. Otherwise, we're keeping those at the in the background, while at the fore we're just trying to push this line of like, oh, poor men, and it makes me a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah. I just want to add to that, Emma. When I was talking about that powerful prevention workforce, like almost every other workforce in the country, it is very, very gendered. So it's mostly early childhood and primary school teachers who are getting the training, what training there is to do this work. The early childhood is over 90% women, primary school is about 80% women. And when we're doing parent workshops, because again, talking structural barriers, there's no childcare, there's no money, there's no food, you get one parent turning up and 80% of the time it's mum. So what you're getting overall is where the skill base exists, where that knowledge base exists, it's resting in women. And when we look at the research or when we do talk to the few fathers who turn up, the two things they say is, oh, it's better if his mother does that. Or, but if I, particularly with younger children, well, people will think that I'm a predator, that I'm going to sexually abuse kids and that's why I'm turning up to this. And I get the fear, but you know what? If enough men turn up, that fear goes away. And also, if we're talking about the village raising our children, only half the village is protecting our children. The other half has just abrogated responsibility. And I would, at that point, be calling men out and saying, if you believe that, not all men, you are a good man, you are not a violent man, where are you? Where are you for those young boys that need that masculinity model that Tarang was talking about? Where are you for those young boys who are watching Andrew Tate and thinking, oh, well, this is how to be a man, and they're not getting other examples? Where are you when we're having those workshops and those classes and reading those books and mum's doing all that work to find out how to keep the children safe? Why are you not participating in this? Because they are your children too. And they are going to grow up to be adults and live in the world too. And if it's not your children, if you're a teacher, if you're a sports coach, if you're a drama coach, if you're a music teacher, why are you not participating in helping boys understand masculinity that they can be proud of, that doesn't have to be dominant?
Absolutely.
And if you're not doing it, why not?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I think there's so many layers I think are coming into this conversation. We're talking about the role that parents can play and the role that educators can play and the systems around it that need to support, whether that's, free, quality, early childhood education.
That would help.
That would really help. Addressing some of the systemic discrimination that we're talking about. And what do you see actually working in education systems? And I know there's no, we haven't seen a perfect solution, but what are some things that we can hold on to and start elevating?
The fact that it's there. I mean, no, it's not perfect, and I can spend hours listing all the things that we are not doing well enough in consent and respectful relationships education, but we're doing it. It is happening in classrooms. I wouldn't always say by any means that bad consent education is better than no consent education, because it's not. It can be really quite toxic. But we're doing our best and we're getting better, and there are so many people and so many organisations looking at what's happening and saying, well, how's it working? What else do we need? What more do we need? What more can we do? And so many people and organisations and teachers and parents turning up to nights like this, listening in to things like this, saying, well, what more can we do? How can we make this better? So the fact that Victoria started respectful relationships education in Australia, I think it was 2016, it was first rolled out here, or first piloted here. And we are seeing results that it's working. We are seeing that some of the boys and girls and non-binary kids, trans kids coming out of those classes where it has been done well, we can see a difference in the attitudes and a better understanding, so that we're not, when we're going into parents and we're having to start with some really basic lessons on gender and power, you don't have to do that with the kids that have done those lessons. You can go, okay, you already know these concepts, let's move on to the next one. So absolutely I can see change happening. Change always takes too long, and it's always too hard, and there's always too much harm that happens along the way. But I went to, I was talking about this earlier tonight, I went to Rosie Batty's book launch a week or two back. It was 10 years since Luke Batty was killed, and I remember watching that first TV interview that she did and how shocking and just heartbreaking it was. But she called it family violence, and I remember sitting there watching it just gasping, because 10 years ago nobody called it that. It was just a man who snapped, who lost control. It was a man who'd been pushed to the edge probably by a woman. It was not family violence, and now we wouldn't call it anything else, and that's only 10 years that took. That those moments where you go, oh, actually we have made change. We have done something. I talk about this a lot, that my mother can remember having milk delivered to her house when she was a child in a horse and cart. And when she comes to my house now, she gets there with a smartphone. When she first got married, the marriage bar had only just been lifted. That was the rule that said that married women were not allowed to work for the government. Rape in marriage was still legal. It was not just, when she started work, it was not just allowed, it was actually required that you pay men more than women because, breadwinners. And domestic violence wasn't a term. It was not something that we even knew about. It was not talked about. Look how far we've come in a lifetime, in one lifetime. And that didn't happen easily. And it's not like men came along and went, would you like some more rights? Here you go. Women fought for that. They fought hard. Those battles were not easy. And I look around now and I go, well, I'm not done yet. And I know so many other people aren't done yet, and those fights to come are going to be really hard, but I'm here for it.
Absolutely.
We're so many people are here for it, and we'll win
And
those
you're
too.
here for it too, by the looks of it. I 100% agree. I think we're doing some research at the moment looking at the role of feminist movements in a number of countries and influencing violence prevention efforts around the world. And in some countries where there's been, incredible government repression, Nicaragua, South Africa, India, and a long arc of history, looking at it over 50 years, you can see that despite the resistance, despite the backlash, we have seen incredible progress, and we have to hold both of those things, don't we? We have to hold the hope, and we have to hold that we can see change and that we are seeing change at the same time as acknowledging that we've still got, a long way to go. I want to dig a little bit deeper before I hand over to the audience questions around the link between, we're talking a lot about misogyny and sexism, but we also know that research shows that misogyny is associated with homophobia and racism and ableism and transphobic attitudes. It's not just sexism that we're grappling with. Tarang, and this is probably the hardest question, and it's the sort of how do we deal with all of that, these intersecting forms of discrimination, which, as you've talked about as well, these are some of the structural barriers that are certainly placing some families and some individuals at even greater risk.
Fuck.
Yeah, sorry.
No,
I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
Endorse that sentiment.
I think it might sound like the most difficult question, but I think it's probably one of the most straightforward to answer in terms of solutions. And let me articulate why. And it's because everything that you explained, right, the homophobia, the racism, the sexism, misogyny, all forms of extremism that can potentially turn to physical acts of violence, right? They can all be resolved through a systemic and structural rethink of ideas of masculinity and then masculinity in practice. Right? The University of Melbourne had this report recently, or published a report recently around what you've just described, right? And they used the example of the Australian man who's the Christchurch shooter and spoke about his homophobia and his transphobia and his obvious racist, violent extremism that resulted in such tragic loss of human life, right? And so in order to address one of these things, we have to address them all. Yep. They don't exist in silos. Human beings don't exist in silos. And unfortunately, a lot of government policy does operate in silos. Government departments, for example, do not converse with each other. The Department of Education does not necessarily work as well as they could, both at state and local and federal levels, with other departments. So there's not that information sharing that needs to take place, right? This idea that we're going to just be able to solve issues of sexism without also solving issues of racism, for example, it's misguided,
absolutely.
right? And I think one of the things in Australia that makes trying to shift masculinities forward so difficult is the inherent racism that's here in Australia. For me, the reason that I ever started writing about these things online was because no one would listen to a person of colour, a man of colour, when I tried to write about them for the media. That's changed now, right? And it wasn't enough that my sister was butchered to death that they would then go, oh, maybe we should listen to you. It still wasn't enough, right? Had I been an Anglo-Australian man, I would have had a different sort of take up by the kind of mainstream media. And so it's this thing where if we want to actually address these things, we have to grapple with the difficulties of all of them, right? And I had an interesting interaction with one of my Monash University students earlier today. She's an exchange student who's come from Mexico 2 weeks ago. And I asked her what she was looking forward to learning most about. And she said, oh, I'm from Mexico and we have conversations around reconciliation and kind of like our history with the Spanish, etc. And it's so amazing that you had the apology to First Nations people and you acknowledge country. And I said, oh, bless, that's the only two things we do. Like, we did one in 2007 and we do the other one every time, just, as a formality. But we had a chance last year, and then I told her about the voice referendum, and she's like, so it got voted down. I was like, oh yes, like very much so. It was terrible. But it's really interesting because we project in Australia this veneer of how great we are, right? But we're really not. Like, we do not. And one of the reasons we're unable to grapple with some of these issues, particularly when it comes to boys and men, is because not only do we have the layers of systemic and structural disadvantage and racism and all the things that we've just talked about, but we also have the constructs of masculinity where men don't seek help, where they don't speak up, where they don't admit weakness or vulnerability. They're not comfortable, men, me included, saying, you know what, I think I might be wrong, right? Or I think I need to grow a bit, or I think I need to develop a bit more. And so that's why I think part of it is that we don't see many, if any, male role models, right? The bar for Australian male role models is the floor. Like, it is, as long as you're not, actively engaging in acts of assault or violence, you're probably fine. And even if you are,
and actually, I'm going to call you. Yeah. No, the bar is not on the floor; it's in hell, and they still can't get over it.
Yeah, I'm trying to be optimistic and positive, but you're right. I agree with you.
No.
I think, like when we don't take opportunities that would feed into our discourse around positive masculinity. And I'll just give you really quickly one example. I remember recently, not by choice, but putting on the TV and seeing Ben Cousins was on the TV. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna see what he has to say. And he's known for being a man who's very good at kicking an oval football and also causing a lot of harm to the women in his life, right? And so when they spoke to him on this TV show, it was framed as being like this redemption arc, and they were like, Ben, you've been through a lot, and I don't like that terminology. It's like, Ben, you've a lot's happened, and what would you like to say? And there was a lot of talk around his issues with addiction, which I thought, good, we need to destigmatise this. We should have honest conversations about this. But at no point did they say, is there anything that you want to say, or is there anything that you've learned about the interactions in your life? And had he used that as an opportunity to go, you know what, I've hurt a lot of people close to me, and I think that I, through those experiences, have learned that I've damaged a lot of relationships, I've hurt a lot of people, and I don't want young boys that, look at me or see me to grow up like and do what I did, like get help first. I just think and I'd imagine that, because that didn't happen, right? Yeah. And the sooner that we see those sporting codes, because we're obsessed in Australia, so as soon as we see that happening, we will make massive amounts of progress. And whether it's the Andrew Tates or other people in the world, they'll lose traction, right? Because as both of you touched on before, these patriarchal attitudes, they harm boys and men. They don't help them.
They absolutely do.
I think the other thing too is that what you were talking about with those connections between racist attitudes and sexist attitudes and the homophobia and the transphobia is they all support each other.
Yes.
So you can't go into a mum's group online and put in a whole lot of misogynistic attitudes about sex ed and consent ed and convince them. But you can go in with a transphobic agenda and absolutely terrify them and have them all saying, oh, I don't want my kid going to those classes because they're going to turn all my kids trans. Yeah. And that happens. And it's a weaponisation. And the other thing too is those right-wing groups are really, really good at working together. So they will all down tools on the misogyny and go, we're doing transphobia today. Okay, good, I'm there. And then they all down tools and go, okay, we're going homophobia, racism, we're together. The left are so good at eating their own.
Yes.
Oh, we're going to down tools because we're too busy fighting each other. I don't care about Donald Trump. I want to fight Joe Biden. I want to fight Kamala Harris. A black woman's going to be US president. No, she's not, because she's not doing enough. And we don't actually say, hey, look, let's learn from what they're doing. You talk about how well funded they are. That's because they work together.
Yeah, the coordinated
They
effort.
Are so coordinated, and they are coordinated globally. There is
100%.
money from American churches in Australia funding right-wing groups here.
Yeah.
Now, we can't even get together and fund ourselves.
No,
right?
Exactly.
We need to get so much better at working with our allies and going, look, I'm not sure that I agree with you on everything, Tarang, but let's link arms and go, because this has got to be changed. Because the things that matter to us, the things that are important to both of us, are the same.
Absolutely.
And that, I think, is also a structural change that we really, really need to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for all their distaste of unions and collective action, the right are very good
They're very
at banding
coordinated.
together.
Yes, they are.
And we just fight
We are
with each other over
rubbish at it.
scraps.
Yeah.
But we can change. And I always say, you know, if there's collective oppression, there's also collective liberation.
Yes.
And because we are dealing with the same things that are trying to oppress us. And so if we do, I think, combine particularly social justice movements when they come together, have
Yes.
incredible power to create change.
Absolutely.
Okay, I might pause there for a second and see if there's any questions from the audience. If you can raise your hand if you have a question, there should be some people with some roving mics. And if people don't have questions, I've always got more.
Hi. I think I wanted to ask, because for me, about what masculinity should be remodeled to be, it's hard for me to imagine in my head what positive masculinity would look like, especially when you're trying to take it away from this idea of dominance. So I was wondering what you guys would imagine a positive version of masculinity would be, and what traits it would have that makes it unique to masculinity. Thanks.
Thank you. I might take one more if there's another question. There's someone at the front.
So in relation to remodelling masculinity, what do you do when the toxic masculinity is so connected to religion? Because you don't touch religion, basically. So
Why not?
how do we, well, if you ask the people within
Yeah, you
there,
do.
you don't. How do you make those changes within something like that?
Good question. Okay, so questions around remodelling masculinity. But given that I have the floor, I can say one little thing, which is, I think one thing we need to move away from is this idea that there is one version of masculinity. There isn't. There are, if you go across cultures, across times, across ages, there are hundreds, millions of versions of masculinity. And even now, while we have an Andrew Tate model of masculinity, there are also incredibly diverse examples of masculinity that we can see in our everyday lives as well. And I think, so it's not about, in my mind, it's not about replacing one model with another. It's about creating space for diverse representations of authentic, respectful, kind, diverse masculinities, and letting people be all the different versions that they want to be, and breaking down those boxes. I think hegemonic masculinity and femininity is the same in a patriarchal society, is designed to be rigid. It's designed to say that there is this one version, and if you do not fit in this one version, there is something fundamentally wrong with you. And we need to challenge that as a starting point.
And I
would
think
say.
perhaps one of the things that men could do is learn from what women and girls have done, because if you look at the rebellion that women and girls have had against that very meek, submissive model of femininity. Now, when we model what a woman can be to young girls, you can be a powerful CEO, you can be a sportswoman, you can be a mother, you can be so many things. You can be a goth shepherdess. You can be anything you like.
What?
You can be a goth shepherdess if you want to too.
Okay.
I'm not being
can,
discriminatory,
Tarang, if
but
you want to.
women and girls have created for ourselves and each other a huge range of examples of ways to be a successful woman. And not all of them are just, you too can be a CEO. If there is a woman doing something amazing, you can guarantee there's another woman in front of her with a phone going, click, share. Because what we're looking for is a range of ways that we can be something other than wife and mother, which is not to say that being a wife and mother is a denigration, but that there are other options available to us. So to be able to say to men and boys that you have the same range, you can aspire to be Taylor Swift, you can aspire to be the goth shepherd that Tarang's going to be one day. You
I'll
can
ask my mum if I'm allowed to be.
that there is such a range of things in the same way that we've done and continue to do for women and girls, that power in ourselves, a feeling of self-worth, a feeling of achievement and pride can come from so many different things. Most of them are not things that are easy. Most of them are things, most of the things I feel proud of anyway have been the really hard things. And to be able to give that to men and say, well, these things that you've done that is hard. So one of the things that I know we say to fathers is the most powerful thing you can do for your small sons is tell them that you get scared. Because the number of 4-year-old boys I've seen sit there and go, I'm not scared. My dad's never scared. My dad's a plumber. He sees scary things all the time, and look, he does.
Yeah.
But then you go and talk to that dad and say, well, I know you get scared because you're a person and people get scared. Tell your son. That is a powerful version of this. So the first question about what does powerful, positive masculinity look like? It looks like that.
Yeah, it's plural masculinities, right? It's and I think Raywyn Connell was a theorist that came up with that dominant idea, hegemonic masculinity, and it almost, unfortunately, her writing has been taken to be like an endorsement of the concept, unfortunately, rather than a description. And when you, Jane, were talking earlier around all of the hard-fought battles that women have done over many generations and still continue to fight, right? For the longest time in the West, there were certain ideas of masculinity, and those ideas of masculinity then became the bedrock of what was the norm or stereotypical masculinity. And so the movement for boys and men is comparatively in its infancy, right? And so positive, pro-social, pro-feminist, whatever we want to call it, inclusive masculinities for boys and men is around developing some of those things. And when, Jane, you talk about, for example, women can be Taylor Swift or a CEO, or they could be a pharmacist or a nurse or a doctor, they could be all different types of things. It's fascinating to me because when I think of the role models that boys and men have, there'll be a footballer, an Australian rules footballer, who also happens to paint his fingernails. And I think, cool, but what else? Like, it's more than just you paint your nails a certain way, right? It's what you said, like saying that you're scared or whatever. And that religion thing, do you mind if I touch on that?
Because and then I'll have
I've got so many thoughts on that, and particularly because some of the work that I've done with culturally and racially marginalised groups over many years has that same complexion, right, in terms of religion and using patriarchy, using religion to mask patriarchy or misogyny or whatever the case may be. And I think that we can actually harness that to our own benefit to bring around certain ideas that we'd like to see and behaviours that we'd like to see. So, for example, if it's in the Catholic Church, going back to what Jesus Christ, for example, actually stood for, right? And actually using the Bible as a source of getting people to see the hypocrisy in how they are arguing current perspectives versus what treat others as you would like to be treated, treat others with respect, equality, kindness, empathy, right? And that translates across all different faiths. And I think that one of the criticisms I have not only of myself at times, but of those who come into meeting with people who are very rigid in their views and use religion, is that sometimes we can come from a holier than thou place, pardon the pun, of being just a little bit like, oh no, how can you think like that, right? Because we see their cognitive dissonance and then we judge them for it. So instead of doing that, being curious and understanding and letting them come to the realization, right? And then using their faith for them, because that faith can often be a really strong driver for changing behaviour. So I think we just need to work with it, and it might take a bit longer and it might be a little bit of a roundabout way. But rather than trying to challenge everything, using that to get where we want to go.
I'll give one example that I think connects both of those dots, which is that, so I did my PhD research in the Maldives, which is where my family is from, and it was on women's experiences of violence, and we collected national data. And what we found was actually the Maldives had a very low prevalence rate of violence compared to other countries in the region. It's an Islamic state, it's in a South Asian context, where you would expect very high rates of violence. And so I was looking at what are some of the factors that are actually driving low rates of violence. And one of the things that I uncovered was actually around models of masculinity. And that a Maldivian at the time, things may be changing, but dominant model of masculinity, or what it meant to be a good man, was around respect and calmness and education. And not raising your voice, let alone being violent, but you were not even supposed to raise your voice as a good man. And I know, if anyone's met my father, you would know that this is very true. So that's an example of a model of masculinity that's very different from an Australian dominant model of masculinity. And so I think there are examples that we can draw from and elevate and take inspiration from. I also grew up in very conservative religions, both Christian and Muslim, and I totally agree with Tarang, and there's a lot of actually good work out there at the moment around, particularly in the Pacific, in parts of some great work happening in Pakistan, for example, around using religious texts and working with faith leaders for them to present alternative interpretations and more feminist interpretations of religious texts. So I will stop there. We have 1 more minute. Has anyone got a very quick question? One at the back.
Thanks. Just interested to know, Jane mentioned earlier about the uptake of the algorithm and joked about her own algorithm getting sullied, but how quickly that sort of thing hits young boys and things like that. I'm just interested to know what expectation or role do you think the government plays in regulation and legislation for managing the algorithms for the social networks?
Great question.
It's a great question. I think there's absolutely a role. I think the stumbling block there that nobody seems to have an answer to is that this is not a national issue. We're used to the state and federal government squabbling about whose responsibility it is, but the Australian government can't regulate TikTok. So this is actually an international issue. Now, there are things that can be done to reduce the risk, but not to completely mitigate the risk. It's a global issue. And I would say the same thing about porn and the same thing about those nudify apps, that all of these things, absolutely governments can play a role in minimising the harm, but I don't think they can completely get rid of it. I think the other thing that has to go hand in hand, like any kind of harm reduction problem, is regulate where you can, but banning doesn't work. And in concert with that regulation is providing education, knowledge and tools so that people understand what it is that they're doing. Because even the most basic stuff about porn, for instance, which we haven't really touched on, but making sure that kids seeing porn and that's getting younger and younger, that they know what they're seeing the first time they see it, not a year later. Because kids are really, really good at understanding that Iron Man doesn't really fly around the world in an iron suit and fire laser beams out of his hands. It's a movie, it's fake. So it's really easy to explain that to them about the way porn works. It's really easy to explain to them also about the way the algorithm works, because for almost all of us, the online world is a tool that we use. For most children now, it is a world where they live. It's a completely different perspective that we don't entirely understand and can't because we didn't grow up in their world. So to understand the context of it is actually far easier for them than we give them credit for. So being able to explain to somebody, this is content being delivered to you by an algorithm for profit, created by somebody for profit, and this is how they're attempting to manufacture shame in you so that they can get money. It's not necessarily going to make every single vulnerable child go, oh, well, I'm never going to watch another Andrew Tate video, because it will be served to them whether they want it or not. But it will give them the context to put it in and a better understanding of why somebody is trying to manipulate them. So they are some very basic things that I think government has not just a role but a responsibility to do. And again, without, it's not usually my shtick, but I think the government is doing something, trying to work out how to do this. They are making some efforts on this. There's a government campaign out at the moment explaining to parents how the algorithm works and how the misogynistic content can get into their kids' devices in ways that they will never see or know. Because, you must, I don't know if you get this a lot, but mum's saying, oh no, Instagram's lovely. And you're like, oh, your Instagram is lovely, I'm sure. Not what your son is seeing on TikTok. Really not. So being able to understand how all that works, yes, government has a role in educating people the way they had a role in educating that nicotine is addictive and smoking is harmful and alcohol is as harmful, and we should also all stop being so lonely.
Yes.
Public health message, you're welcome.
Come and join us for a drink afterwards. No, I will end with one final question that is very, very quick, and it's a multiple choice. We've come to the end of the road, and if anyone is a Boys to Men fan will get that.
That's what I thought we were here for. I don't know. I've just been sitting up here
so you
talking
can
about
either answer the question, what is your favourite Boys to Men song, or leave us with one thing that gives you hope. I know, Tarang, you should answer the Boys to Men question.
You know when you called them a 90s group before, I took issue with that. I just want to say, because I was like, they're for all time. And while we're talking about masculinity, I find it interesting that now we've got, you know, such profane kind of like degrading lyrics, and then I think of Boys to Men, and they're just like pleading for like, you know, just affection and to like show up for the women. And I was like, why can't we bring that back?
Maybe that's the solution.
I think what gives me hope is that every time I'm in spaces like where I'm here today at the Wheeler Centre, I look out and I see a cross-section and diversity of men who are engaged and are passionate and are interested. And to some of the points Jane raised earlier about it taking a village, it's that community of men who will make a fundamental difference. And women and non-binary folk, they need our support and our allyship. And so I get hope from that.
Thank you.
Yeah, because we're tired. Yeah.
What gives you hope, Jane?
Young people. It's for everyone, you know, we're talking a lot tonight about those boys that follow Andrew Tate. What we didn't talk about was the other end of the polarisation, where those kids are so smart and so knowledgeable and so sophisticated in their understanding of empathy and how it affects their lives and how it affects their sense of themselves and their sense of other people. And I have had better explanations of what consent really is and how it works from 12-year-olds than I've had from grown adults, because they care about it and they think about it and they want other people to understand it, and they're so pleased to share their knowledge. They're so delighted when they can tell you things that they know and they understand. And you know, sometimes I walk out of classrooms frustrated. I've walked out of a couple in tears, but most of them I walk out feeling that the world is going to be a better place, and that classroom, those kids in that classroom are going to play a part in that, and that's such a good feeling.
Amazing. That's a wonderful note to end on. Everyone put your hand together for my two incredible panellists. Thank you, Emma.